Assalamu alaikum. I hope everyone is doing well and absolutely pain-free at this moment. I wish you never have pain in your life, be it physical, be it emotional, but at some point in your life, as a doctor, as a physician, you will quite often come across patients who will seek your help for management of their pain. Okay, so it is highly critical for one to understand the physiology of pain, and that relevance we will discuss the spinothalamic tracts today. Okay, so to begin with, this is the pathway. The spinothalamic tract is a sensory pathway that transmits the sensations of crude touch, pain, and temperature from different parts of the body through the spinal cord all the way to the somatosensory cortex. Okay, and we will cover this topic under three headings. The first part will cover the neuroanatomy. Secondly, we will discuss the physiology of this pathway, and still later we will briefly discuss the relevant clinical disorders that could possibly arise in this whole pathway. So as I mentioned, the sensations transmitted through this pathway are crude touch, pain, and temperature. And quite interestingly, we have only one type of peripheral receptors for all these modalities of sensation. We have free nerve endings for this purpose. Okay, and they are distributed so generously that they are everywhere in our body. The superficial skin, deeper tissues, okay, the bone, the joints, the epithelial lining of the gut, etc., etc. Okay, and they are usually stimulated. They are usually stimulated after tissue injury. So for pain or even temperature to cause stimulation of those free nerve endings, we need to have tissue damage. Actually, tissue damage owing to injury, owing to pain, to injury or temperature causes the release of a variety of chemical mediators here at this level. Okay, we have bradykinin, we have serotonin, histamine, potassium ions, acids, acetylcholine, and so many others. Okay, the release of those chemical mediators cause the stimulation of the peripheral nerve fibers, the free nerve endings, okay, which are actually neurons whose cell bodies reside there in the dorsal root ganglia. Okay, they are connected to the peripheral tissues through their peripheral axons, while they project into the spinal cord through their central processes. Okay, and normally we have two types of pain fibers. Okay, because we have different types of pains. We have fast pain called sharp pain, pricking pain, electric pain, etc. And we have slow, dull, aching pain variety. So the free nerve endings reserved for transmission of each one of these are different. Okay, for example, we have the neospinothalamic tract that transmits fast pain, and we have the paleospinothalamic tract that conducts or transmits slow pain. Okay, accordingly, the nerve fibers, the free nerve endings reserved for their transmission are different. Okay, the free nerve endings constitute the first order neurons. They are connected with the peripheral parts of the body, and they project into the spinal cord where they synapse and the dorsal gray horns of the spinal cord. But well before synapsing there in specific laminae, what they do, they ascend for a level or two before synapsing, and those we have specific areas reserved for fast pain fibers and slow pain fibers. Okay, the fast pain is usually transmitted through type A delta fibers. Okay, and the velocity of transmission is quite high, about 5 to 30 meters per second. Okay, and they are myelinated. Okay, and they terminate here in the lamina 1 of the spinal cord. Okay, we normally have these dorsal gray horns, the dorsal gray matter is divided into specific laminae. They are usually 10. Okay, the fast pain fibers terminate here in lamina 1 here. Okay, while the slow pain fibers are they are actually type C fibers, non-myelinated. They are non-myelinated, and the velocity of conduction too is quite lower, about 0.5 to 1 meter per second. Okay, and those slow fibers terminate in the laminae 2, 3, 5. This is how we can go the easy way. Well, the pain fibers of either type, fast pain fibers and slow pain fibers, terminate here in specific laminae of the spinal cord. The fast pain fibers terminate in lamina 1. The slow pain fibers are unmyelinated and they terminate here in lamina 2, 3 and 5. Okay. Now, soon after the synapse on the cell bodies of neurons, here in these laminae, we get the second order neurons, okay, which are the second order neurons. Those fibers cross to the opposite side of the spinal cord through the anterior commissure, okay, and thereafter they project all the way to the thalamus on the opposite side of the spinal cord. This further ascent is on the contralateral side, okay, where in the thalamus they synapse with cell bodies of neurons in the ventrobasal complex, most of them, okay, and this is the second, it constitutes the second order neuron. From the thalamus, those fibers project to the somatosensory cortex of the same side. There is only one crossover to the opposite side in the spinal cord, okay, so that finally the right somatosensory cortex receives information from left half of the body, okay. Here at this level, this was about the neospinothalamic tract. The paleo-spinothalamic tract, the one that is reserved for transmission of slow pain, actually has a little differences in its course. The first order neurons terminate in lamina 2, 3 and 5 of the dorsal gray matter. The second order neurons cross to the opposite side like fast fibers, as we mentioned, but here at this level only 1/4 or 1/10 terminate in the thalamus, and that makes about 10% to 25% of those fibers, spinothalamic fibers, terminate or synapse here in the thalamus. The remaining fibers project to other destinations, okay. Some of them project to the reticular areas of the pons, medulla and mesencephalon, okay. Some of them project to the tactile area of the mesencephalon, and still later some of them project to the periaqueductal gray area around the aqueduct of Sylvius. We will discuss the significance of those projections, but still, irrespective of the route they follow, from these areas we just mentioned, for the paleo-spinothalamic tract, the pain signals are finally transmitted through short interneurons to the intralaminar nuclei of the thalamus, okay, and the ventrolateral nuclei of the thalamus, as well as to some parts of the hypothalamus. So there are slight differences in their course in the spinal cord and brain, but finally they also project to the somatosensory cortex, though through a different route, okay. So this is the neuroanatomy. Well, at this level you may go the simple way as I discussed, but if you want to make things complicated like my neuroanatomy colleagues, here I wish to, on a lighter note, I wish to share the words of one of my colleagues who feels like our colleagues in neuroanatomy department have a temptation to make things difficult, okay. For example, during viva exam, when the students are already under immense stress, they already look quite frightening in that situation for no good reason, but they will begin with how many laminae are there in the spinal cord? 10, okay, and they will ask the second question, tell me their names, okay, and those names for each laminae is, I guess, occupying the neurons for no good reason. Anyhow, if that is the case, we call the lamina 1, where the neospinothalamic tract or the fast pain fibers actually synapse, we call that lamina marginalis, okay. The laminae 2 and 3 is what they call substantia gelatinosa, okay, and the lamina 5 is what they call nucleus proprius, okay. If somebody is lucky enough and to be able to recall all those names, the very next question is, well, you are actually right, but tell me about their nicknames. This is what they do, Okay, so that was perhaps enough for the neuroanatomy part, and now we proceed to the physiology part. So the first order neurons are there. First order neurons are the free nerve endings, and they are stimulated by tissue injury, because tissue injury releases those chemical mediators we mentioned earlier. There are so many, but if they want to select you one and multiple choice questions, go for bradykinin, because that is the most potent one. Okay. Secondly, those first order neurons synapse and other neurons in the lamina of spinal cord, and at those points, at those nerve endings, they secrete specific substances. The fast fibers secrete what we call glutamate. Okay. The slow fibers of the spinothalamic tract. This is, we can't call it spinothalamic tract at this point. Okay, it is the course later from the second order neurons to the thalamus, where we call them spinothalamic tract. But the slow pain fibers release both glutamate and substance P. Okay, here again, if they want you to select one, go for substance P, because most of the time, most of them secrete substance P, and only few of them secrete glutamate. Okay, still later. Here, the spinothalamic tract projects primarily to the ventrobasal complex of the thalamus. Now, this area receives sensory input from the dorsal column medial lemniscal system as well, and the trigeminal pathway as well. So this is a final common destination for those pathways as well. And here, the significance of the spinothalamic tract fibers projecting to these alternate destinations: the reticular nuclei of the pons, medulla, and mesencephalon, the tactile area of the mesencephalon, and the periaqueductal gray area. This is quite significant. For example, the fibers that project to the reticular formation are the tactile area. These areas are primarily responsible for, keeping one awake, alert, conscious. Okay, so this is why whenever we have a painful stimulus, at some point in our body, we can't fall asleep in that condition. So they tend to keep you awake in the setting of a painful stimulus. Okay, you can't fall asleep that easily. While the periaqueductal gray area, this is one of those areas which constitute the analgesia system of the brain. So the fibers projecting to this area, the periaqueductal gray area, will make a mechanism for the brain to suppress those pain signals. Okay, and still later, the fibers finally project to the somatosensory cortex. Okay, here again, the fibers from left half of the body will project to the right somatosensory cortex and vice versa. Okay, so even though that is the final destination, removal of the somatosensory cortex doesn't affect the perception of pain, and that is quite interesting. Okay, if we could remove the somatosensory cortex, we will have certain deficits, but pain perception will remain intact. Okay, so there is a proposition, there is a proposed theory that somatosensory cortex here in the case of spinothalamic tract is perhaps associated with perception of quality of pain, what type of pain it is. Okay, the lower centers, the thalamus, and those we just mentioned are actually sufficient enough to perceive pain. Pain perception occurs at a lower level, thalamus and below. The somatosensory cortex is merely concerned with perceiving or assessing the quality of pain and somewhat localization of pain. Okay, so that was the physiology part. Now we move on to some clinical disorders which are relevant to this pathway.